Okay, good round of applause for Dr. Nugent, keeping us going, firing us up. So we are going to make sure that we catch up a little bit here on schedule, and then the risk of you not participating is no one gets a happy hour. So I'm just threatening that early and often. So, eye contact, putting all that energy in, staying with us, or no happy hour. That's science, right, Sean? I don't make the rules. So I would love to introduce everybody on this panel, but if I've learned anything in my little life, especially with Daniela, Tim, and Nadya, me speaking for them is probably not a good strategy for my long-term success. So I am Adam Paulisick. I am lucky enough to teach here at Tepper and across campus with some of the other folks you've met in human-computer interaction and the Masters in Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning. I've been around for CME for about 10 years, and most of my life has been spent as some sort of a management consultant or an entrepreneur or an investor along that journey. So we are going to be talking about data-driven innovation today. But before we do that, I've intentionally picked 3 people that I think will fight in front of you for your entertainment value about exactly what that means. All right, there we go.
No
people are sort of in
takers.
that dip after lunch, right? We're coming together. We'll pull you in. But on a genuine note, I really was inspired when I talked to Tim and Nadya and Daniela about how they feel about this, because they all agree not to just give you blog post wisdom, right? They just agree that you could Google your own definitions of innovation to some degree, and that the points we're going to make today are going to be specific and intentional to create some kind of conversation, hopefully here at the campus and then shortly after. So with that in mind, I'm just going to go run down right here the row. So I'm going to beg for the 60-second introduction. You know how we try to keep it going here in the afternoon. But Danielle, maybe you could say hello and a little bit about what you're up to these days.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Daniela Osio. I am the CEO of Kloopify. Kloopify's mission is to integrate sustainability data into every procurement process so that they can make smarter choices around the suppliers and the commodities that you purchase in order to achieve your impact reduction goals. Previous to this, I worked at DuPont, leading various initiatives in the procurement space, as well as implementing and designing a risk management organization for the electronics and imaging business, which led to some wildly successful wins during the pandemic. We'll go into it maybe a little bit later, but that is who I am, and I'm really grateful to be here and to speak with all of you.
Okay, so your first contender is both sides of the table, Daniela. She's been both an entrepreneur and a corporate executive. Tim.
Hello, my name's Tim Murphy. I'm a business leader at Philips, located here in Pittsburgh on our sleep and respiratory care group. I've been at that company a long period of time, 30 plus years. I've seen it kind of grow up from sub 10 million to now well over 2 billion, and kind of been on the way up and the way down many times over that 30-year period. I always think that Sean and the team here are playing a practical joke by inviting me here. And so I'm always flabbergasted to be invited here. And I'm impressed that a member of my team, our former team, Bob Barker's here. Anything I know about innovation, especially in the software space, I've learned from Bob and listening to him. So I will try not to embarrass you, and I'll get a grade at the end, right, Bob?
All right, so Tim will be writing the character of, I've been through 3 full decades of the same organization, which means I know where literally all the bodies and the mainframes are buried. Nadya.
Most recently, Chief Marketing Officer and Head of Decision Sciences, not data science, I've been listening about data science all day long. Decision Sciences for Volta Charging, which is an EV charging company, which is also a commerce media company. More on that in terms of the comments I make on innovation later. But prior to that, that's my 8th year in a startup. Prior to that, I was with a location data company called PlaceIQ. And prior to that, I spent 11 years at Experian Marketing Services, one of the mothers of all data pipelines, in a variety of roles, none of which existed before I had them. So I feel that I have the freedom fighter battle scars to show for how you do corporate innovation, for better or for worse. So I'm happy to offer those to you today.
Excellent. All right. Everyone, round of applause for our panelists coming up here, sharing their genius. So Nadya, I thought our panel was loosely sort of defined, especially after Dr. Nugent, this idea of kind of data-driven innovation. What exactly would you say that is for everyone's benefit?
All right, full disclosure, when we were preparing for this panel, I said to Adam, I'm like, if I had a dime for every time somebody wants me to tell them about data innovation, I'd be rich. I wouldn't need a day job. And that was a cheeky way of saying that I come from a background where a lot of companies have asked me what to do about the data, how they can innovate their way into their next horizon. And I've never felt so seen as listening to everything that has been talked about today. It's about the question. It's about your customer. It's about what represents growth for your company. And so, to me, data innovation takes on this, sort of veneer of it's got to be a home run. It can be a base hit. It's got to be magical like Watson or something. No, it needs to grow revenue by 20%, maybe save
R.I.P.
costs.
Watson.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, right. And or it can save you money too, right? So, and I think that innovation, I think people think it needs to be transformative. Oh, guess what? If it's adjacent, but it lets you eat your competitor's lunch, oh, that's a good feeling, a good day at the office. So
Okay.
that's what it represents to me, but it doesn't represent one monolithic thing.
Well, I'm going to let Tim throw a big wrench in your definition here for a moment
nice.
because, Tim and I were talking last night. I said, I promise not to embarrass you mostly. But what Tim and I were actually talking about, and this is actually really powerful for me because it actually did change my frame about how I wanted to ask this question. So we talk a lot about innovation like it's a growth capture mechanism, right? I think Nadya captured it well. It can be people and processes and facilities and, to some degree, lightly data-driven or very heavily data-driven. But Tim, you brought up an interesting, I would call it an evolution, or maybe it is a transformation for your business about, hey, at one point you started and it was all hardware. We certainly a software piece, but you actually brought some other theme up with me, what hoping you could lead us with here is that sometimes it's the challenging events or it's the market changing events that actually cause your fastest accelerators and your willingness to invest, which is not necessarily our default. Would you mind kind of expanding on that thought?
Yeah, I guess the theme I was trying to make out is that's in many parts of our history as a company and growing, we've lived and operated through some very profitable, very high growth times. And in those times, it's hard to create kind of what I would call a crisis, a reason to do something. And so you end up with what looks like PowerPoint innovation. There's no doubt for roadmaps to expand, no doubt of cool things to do, but you're really not innovating to any kind of real crisis. And so the thing that I'm taking away and learning, especially as we're in our current history, is the power of crisis to drive innovation effectively and the power of crisis to really focus you on the core needs of your customer that apply to that crisis that then can be transferred into the real commercial when you return back to normal business.
So what struck me, if we kind of continue down our way for Daniela, is that Daniela has this really interesting view on the world, right? Which is, hey, I would like to make a lot of money, but also not poison your children, which I think is fair. It's a good compromise to make. It's what I seek in every service that I participate in. But specifically about how can I take what Dr. Nugent and others are highlighting and take first-party and third-party data and sort of humans in the loop and figure out if the way I am buying and the way I'm consuming is actually doing good or bad. But Daniela, you have a tale of two doors whenever you come to Tim or Nadya's office, which is you can talk about all the future and the ambition and the growth, or you could talk about the rain cloud that is forming above their shareholder deck while they're thinking about how they're going to not destroy the planet while they make an awful lot of money. Which one do you like to choose when you're talking to the Tim and Nadyas of the world?
That's a great question. And I would say I go back to what Rebecca was saying is what's the business case for this? So how is this going to help you either drive revenue or improve shareholder value? And it kind of comes back to that. And if you can answer that question for them, if you can help them see how using a tool can enable them to make better decisions, it's not my place to tell them what to do, but it's my place to show them the areas that they can focus on so that they can make the moves that are best aligned for their business, as there's the subject matter experts on this.
That's www.klupify.com. So the idea, though, is, there is a lot of this enablement and this support, but, Tim, if I come back to you on this piece, especially in crisis, but it could be in a growth zone, too. You've had a lot of those, more than crisis, certainly. Which one do you prefer? Do you want someone to come in and be like, listen, here's the probability of the possibility of failure, and here's the fear of missing out, and I'm going to challenge you to just move or get fired or get removed by the board, or I'm going to ultimately say, hey, this is your future, and we are legacy building here. What is the key to at least your point of view about when you activate and really start to pull out the big checkbook, not the small credit card?
Well, I think to Daniela's point, I think it really is connecting to the question that the business is trying to answer. I think if you try to come in and try to show a new question or a question that's not connected to the strategy of the company, it's going to be hard, even in spite of the altruistic or great proposition, to really assimilate it into the normal execution of the business. So anything you can do to connect that particular initiative into the initial strategy of the company or into the things that they're innovating around and amplify it by giving them a new angle by which to bring that innovation to market and market it successfully. I'm always about assimilation to the existing strategy of the company versus trying to change or trying to come in as a third rail and say, let's have a separate initiative around this. Resources and time and just attention spans in companies will just not afford that to be done. And I've seen that explained to Danielle last night inside our own company and our own sustainability initiative. It struggles because it cannot effectively connect to the true nature of the day-to-day operation of that business.
You know, and it's interesting, Tim, we were talking a little bit about this U-curve where when things are really exciting and there's sparks that are happening all around us, they tend to get invested in when it's $50,000 to $100,000 at a time. But when you start talking tens of millions of dollars, you start getting really scary in these acquisitions of $250 million plus, everybody knows how to do that, whether they're excited about paying that premium or not. I guess my question is, what happens in the middle that causes such the fallout from this, landscape, or as, recovering consultant, I would say graveyard of really actually good innovation and the really big gap to $1 billion? And Nadya, one of the reasons I wanted to kind of tip this over to you is you've actually done this really interesting, which is you've always been data-driven as long as I've known you, but you were in the kind of engine room operating platform at Experian. PlaceIQ in its own right was a borderline corporate venture with Alibaba's initial kind of an earliest kind of U.S. investments, and obviously Volta Charging is, quite riding the wave of where EVs are at least here today. But when you were at all three of those businesses, whether it was cranking in the data room or it was figuring out the location of advertising, or of course now when we're in front of a Whole Foods staring with our EVs, how did you convince everybody not just to make all the small bets or the really big acquisitions? Like, where did you live in the middle? How did you start to navigate that? With therapy.
I love how you expressed it, which was living in the middle. And I was going to jump on the back of what Tim said, because if it's adjacent, if people, first of all, sorry, let me pause. One of the things I loved about what Tony said this morning was how he talked about innovating. And what I loved about it was that he said it has to pencil out. Like, somebody's got to believe it, right? And so being data-driven about approaching that market and sizing it, and then, by the way, giving yourself an 80% haircut and see if you still believe it, is important. And so I would say that in the big bets, if it's adjacent and if you've done your homework at doing the storytelling at the executive levels, there is nothing more powerful than an executive level sponsor that believes in it and opens doors of inertia that exist inside a large company. Because a lot of times a large company will not do something, not because the people are mean or they just want to see you fail. You have to create almost an oral tradition. And so you have to start talking at the C-level. And if you find yourself that champion, he cleared barriers for us on the audience platform that I was a founder of. He cleared barriers left, right, and center of folks that had legitimate fears and concerns of automating something that would make them lose their job. That's a really valid reason to pause in your innovation to reflect back to the company that you understand that and why their role is actually much more important than they saw it as. But the second thing I would say is if it's not immediately adjacent, but you're like, you've got fire in your belly and you're like, I know we should do this and I know our customers want it and I know they'll buy it. You actually go to a Tim and you go, look, off the edge of the plate, can I have the small credit card? I promise I'll just do small amounts. And then you sell KPIs as to the gates you're going to go through with your multidisciplinary stakeholders. You're going to go through gates and you're going to keep storytelling and you're going to keep your team focused on those KPIs so that you can get the next charge on the small credit card, which may then lead to like the big Megillah.
So Tim, we're talking about your credit card. So, I'm sure you've only been asked one time in your entire career at Philips to spend money in the innovation budget. But hypothetically, what are the big criteria? So Nadya comes as your chief marketing officer, Daniela comes as your head of ESG and sustainability, maybe has some investor relations dynamics in there. And they come to you and they say, hey, listen, I just need, which is like the signature way of asking, $350,000. Could you just talk out loud a little bit in sort of both, kind of historical terms, but also staring down the face of maybe some wobbly economic certainty, because I'm going to ask Danielle about that next. What are the big things now that you are qualifying these opportunities with, data-driven or otherwise, compared to 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think the first thing I look towards is I first look to the credibility of the person. Who's the person that's telling me this story? Mm-hmm. And I hate to say that, but there's an initial filter around who's the person and what's their credibility as an individual.
Well, let's say they went to CMU.
Okay, that's a minus, but okay. Burn. You said it out there. So
yes.
Right.
I feel like
so
I
that would be a
myself.
plus. That would be a plus. Yeah. I would believe them in just inherently. I'd say yes, just right there. I think the second thing is I say how much, what have we done to actually show and prove something here? It's one thing to come and say, hey, I want $350,000 and I've done nothing. I've done no proof of concept. I've done no voice of customer. I really haven't tried to even stand this up initially or even getting any kind of initial traction. So I always look for evidence that we have something to base our decision on. Like, what have we tried? And even if it's failed, but we know that that's failed, that gives us confidence that this other thing may work. So I really look for evidence of something being done, some sweat equity that's been invested. And the money itself, whether it's got 1 comma, 2 commas, it really isn't the most important thing in the decision. It's what's the value of the idea and how much evidence have we produced that this will produce the result that we want, and show me some small steps, and now believe.
Well, as the other half of my business comedic duo, Megan, would say, the idea here is that you want kids that are going to get out of their chair, right? They're actually going to do the thing. Now, Daniela, here's the kind of devil's advocate interpretation of that answer. So you work in a business around supply chain and procurement, which is arguably at the epicenter of like every big business, right? Tens of thousands of suppliers. But our lens on where innovation needs to be created around that is a shifting sands proposition, right? And not Tim or Nadya, of course, and never anyone in this audience, but someone does this thing called bright, shiny object syndrome, where they start thinking about a problem and they start hearing about technology like AI and ML or all the other buzzwords that are happening. And then they say, yeah, we need that on this. And, if I look at procurement, there's been a progression, right? I mean, I think that we are becoming more data-driven in procurement sustainability. Mm-hmm. I don't know the theme has always been ESG. And even within ESG, we talk about carbon or we talk about plastics and we talk about the diversity of our suppliers. And there's so many important, meaningful ways to build equity in the organization and meaningful shareholder value. But how do you think about what story to tell to what executive, knowing that the last year of investment in procurement and RFP cycles for your services like yours were, let's say, around DE&I, and this year they're focused on ESG, and next year they're going to focus specifically on plastics because the EU is regulating it. How do you choose which bright, shiny object or what narrative to go to a business with?
Yeah, I think it comes down to also understanding who you're talking to and the business that you're talking to, and what are the goals that business has set. And the transformations that they've already gone through. And then while you understand those goals and the transformation, then you can tailor your conversation also to who you're talking to, whether it's the CFO, the CMO, the CPO, or the CEO. Each one of them is going to view this problem through a different lens in the way that it affects them. So tailoring your conversation and your dialogue in a way that you can prove value, even if it's an adjacent kind of function, is how I would tailor the conversation. And then really look at an outcome-oriented discussion. So instead of these are all the problems or this is this hurricane that's coming your way, it's about here are the tools and the assets that you've historically used that allow you to outcompete your competitors, and this is what's coming, and this is what you can use to then do that again.
So, Nadya, just to kind of mirror this, Danielle's kind of talking an inside-out game, right, about how to move it. You have kind of a different point of view on external forces, especially external forces that are starting to pick up some speed. And, we started the conversation with SaaS, and I was hoping you could fill everybody in about sort of why you're feeling just things move faster right now than they have ever moved.
I think it goes back to what Rebecca was saying, which is we've democratized access to data. And so that sounds like a terrific thing, unless, I guess one area that I, as an inveterate data practitioner, am focusing on right now is data privacy and data ethics, right? So if you listen to all the buzzwords, it takes a lot to just keep up with the topics and trends surrounding data. Then add to that the tools, add to that the languages, add to that a whole host of other things. Now add to that the fact that we have exogenous forces that will impact access to data, right? So we live as commercial entities, we live as companies who have to sell things to consumers in many cases in order to succeed. And yet, what we've done is we've sort of treated data as something that doesn't belong to them, for instance. So a place where I'm actually very heartened about data innovation is something that I'm sort of calling priv tech, privacy tech, right? Which ensures that the pipelines that Rebecca was talking about, so we were talking about analysis that has to do with COVID. Well, that's covered by HIPAA. That's legislation. That means that anything you do has to follow a set of rules, right? And so the exogenous forces are those things which will either compel us, or if we do it the right way, embrace it as innovation. We don't hesitate to think about a feature on a product that will enchant the consumer. We don't hesitate to think about that delight moment. I forgot who was talking about it. I think it was Ross from Lowe's, that has a delight moment. Well, we should be doing that with the things that are our lifeblood in terms of understanding them better, data, and ensure that the way it's procured is unimpeachable, transparent, and makes it so that we can engage in a virtuous cycle of its use that improves either health outcomes, sustainability outcomes, and so forth.
Really well said. So one of the things you're sparking for me, at CSL we do an awful lot of executive education, and that typically is someone who is really hit the kind of boss level of their gear, right? They are 20 or 25 years in their career, they are doing meaningful and differentiated work. But one of the other interesting things we've noticed is that there's a sense of concentric circles that Rebecca brought to us, and it was kind of like AI is the big family, and then ML lives inside of it, and a variety of supervised or unsupervised models can live within it. And these simple models really started to bring clarity to even people that have been in and around and talking, frankly, and using words like AI and ML for years. And so we're seeing for the first time the speed of topics and themes and vocabulary and tooling, and I'm thinking again about Rebecca's landscape of just how many new libraries have been released in the last 30 days, let alone 3 years. How are we thinking about the idea of just simply keeping up while you're also trying to do this crazy thing like run your actual business? And maybe, Tim, I could start to you because you've talked a lot about kind of how things are accelerating around innovation here, but how do you try to keep up? What kinds of things are really resonating with you? How do you budget your time now that things are moving, in your case, maybe from hardware to software or other kind of big shifts in your business?
Yeah, I guess it's the first thing I'd say is you don't keep up. You just don't. You try to be relevant, and you try to stay relevant to your customer, and you try to stay relevant to the people that you're working with every day. My sense is I really focus on, what's the lens by which our customer is now operating, and are we staying current to the lens that they see value? I think what I've noticed even in our own company and others is you don't stay as current as you need, and your innovation roadmap is lagging the lens of your customer. And as a result, especially with some delays in any innovation pipeline, you are typically late and you're typically behind the lens. And I think for me, it's always saying spend your time making sure that you're staying as current with the lens that the customer is viewing value, and innovate to that current and or prospective lens versus, hey, we're very, very good at this and we've been very, very successful at this, because I think this pace of change will make that irrelevant.
Yeah, well said. So Daniela, you have a slightly different challenge. Obviously, you can't not keep up with what you're doing, right? You are the person who's trying to sell the thing you're doing. But when things are moving at the speed with lots of acronyms like ESG, sustainability, carbon reduction, scope 1, 2, 3, horizon 1, 2, 3, right? I mean, Paris Accord. I mean, pick your kind of metaphor here. people don't always necessarily associate any one of those things with innovation. How have you started to bridge concepts that felt like general value, like sustainability, because every publicly traded company has a chief sustainability officer, with specific value? Like, how do you motivate people to create a sense of urgency? And I'd look to Nadya and Tim to mirror this and say, hey, is this actually how you create a sense of urgency to act now? Because yeah, we know we need to do better on the planet, but we need to fix a few things first, or we need to roll out the next 3,000 charging centers or deploy the next model. So how do you start to create a sense of urgency about actually acting on your initiatives, and maybe broadly for everyone else who's trying to penetrate the corporate ecosystem?
Yeah, I think it comes down to understanding the factors that are driving the action. So we're seeing a lot of regulatory pressure, investor pressure, customer pressure, and we're actually starting to see that sustainability is no longer going to be a nice to have, but a required to play in the future environment. So when you frame it as this is going to be essential for your business to do, whether you start now or you start 5 years down the line, the nice thing about starting now is that you get ahead of the curve, right? You get to plan with enough time, you get to execute on the goals and the strategy that you've set. And if you wait until the moment of no return, there's a risk involved with that. The risk is that you become obsolete, that you fail to compete in the future way of doing business. And the COVID pandemic has really highlighted some things for corporations in general, is that sustainability is no longer, this lip service that we've been able to do for the last 5 to 7 years. And that, because of the regulatory pressure and customer pressure, and it affecting the bottom line. If you look at contracts that have been canceled, over $11 billion of contracts have been canceled due to unsustainable business practices. So it's really affecting the bottom line as well. And you need to be able to identify these future waves that are coming and prepare for them, and use innovation and use data to help with your decision-making process along the way.
Okay, Tim and Nadya, though, but every entrepreneur is going to say this, right? Everyone's going to say, this is important, things are coming, if you don't act now, the storm will be upon you. How do you filter? How do you react? How do you coach the entrepreneur ecosystem to give you what you want?
I guess I'll go back to a theme and say all that resonates in and of itself as a topic, and it's hard to say, hey, I don't care about that, or I'm not interested. To me, it's really saying, hey, companies are driven by reliability, they're driven by quality, they're driven by cost containment, they're driven by stability of supply chain and competitive advantage. And as much as you can connect this new kind of language or new initiative as being a key enabler of those pillars that drive companies' kind of mindset, it will, first of all, help kind of assimilate, get them to understand, get them to accept it as just part of the core innovation aspect. And then through that credibility, I think you then can create its own separate identity, its own separate importance, because you've found a way to assimilate it into the existing infrastructure and how companies think and what topics they consider as they innovate.
I always hated this expression, brownfield, but we used it a lot in consulting to express the difference between greenfield, sort of new venture, kind of blue ocean kind of exploration, whereas, kind of this brownfield moment was like, hey, start me and meet me where I am. I have all these amazing distribution channels or assets or data or manufacturing relationships. Nadya, what about for you? I mean, obviously, you have largely been, although recently in kind of the hardware business again, but you've largely been without interfaces or hardware or necessarily always predictable things like supplier relationships to kind of manage. How does someone create urgency for you to develop your innovation ecosystem?
So, as everyone was answering, the main thing that comes to mind for me is, as somebody who has lived in the corporate environment, it was up to me to be the interpreter of the market and sort of where the horizon was headed, and the meet me where I am piece, right? Especially at Experian, one of their superpowers is they're very financially oriented, right? And so it's very black and white to some degree. So in being somebody with a yen for innovation, what you had to do was learn how to code shift properly. And one of the things that I would traditionally do is actually, to use something that Tim was saying, I had my board, sort of informal board of directors of entrepreneurs, to parse what was out there for me, right? All of us are in corporate development, not just the folks in corporate development who, by the time a book lands with the thud on Tim's desk to say, hey, should we acquire it? It means it's being shopped. that's going to be expensive and too late, in my view, right? So the way to get the attention of the powers that be or the C-suite of an organization is because the Danielas of the world will be talking to me about what's happening in the marketplace, right? And so sometimes I would use that as a tactic to create a partnership, which would then give Daniela sort of first chance if we decided to acquire such a company. But she would be doing so on the basis of pleasing our customers and helping them with a true and a legitimate need. And it's so often that what Tim was saying before was like, do you have a big sweeping strategic initiative, or do you have a crisis? Actually, living in the middle means you pick something like, for instance, what Daniela is doing, and the C-suite says, well, wait a second, head of revenue over here has been telling me, like anecdotally, that X and such keeps getting asked of us, and we don't have that capability, right? So if you're able to code shift, quantify, and point to customer centricity, especially if it's in something adjacent that you should own, I very much am a proponent of the old chestnut, right? If you get told that the organization doesn't want to do something because it's going to cannibalize existing business, guess what? There are a handful of entrepreneurs out there already wanting to kill your business that you're afraid of cannibalizing. So maybe you should be taking steps to cannibalize yourself. In that scenario, you can actually pace how the pricing goes to create best shareholder value.
So I'm going to give everyone here on the panel just a couple of seconds to think about what they want to leave everybody with, anchored on the idea of what could you do in the next 12 to 18 months to really accelerate as fast as possible? Or what's your biggest warning you want to offer to anybody who's maybe not seen or felt directly like an economic downturn or potential some global instability? And while we do that, I just want to kind of summarize that the power of what I think we're seeing up here is not just entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship, but actually a combination thereof. And I'm inspired and excited that we're now seeing C-suite executives really think of themselves, as maybe they always have, as entrepreneurs, really needing to reinvent or think about entrepreneurs that are outside of the organization as meaningful forces and not just kind of the top 10 in the ecosystem. With that in mind, Daniela, I'd love to hear, if you had to give sort of one non-day job oriented perspective on, hey, what would you coach to the C-suite, or what would the C-suite coach you on to kind of either be wildly successful, something different maybe that's changing compared to 6 or 12 months ago, or really something to avoid? What comes to mind?
Oh man, I'm going first.
Should we skip to Tim? Tim looks like he's got an
Tim
answer.
looks like he's ready for this question. I mean,
I'm going to pick on something I heard Rebecca say. The one thing, and a lot of the stuff she shared was way over my head for sure, and I need the pictures again. But I like the value of
you and me both, and I teach here.
Of the data journalist, because the thing that I'm finding that's most critical is the ability to explain information to people. Yeah. And sometimes that information, as those charts, is not easy to explain, and rightfully so. And so I love the idea of hiring writers, hiring people who can write and who can explain and share information efficiently. If I've learned something over the last year in the situation and the way the business is operating today, it's the value of individuals who can explain things that are complicated easily. So I love the data author.
Well, I think you've nailed on something. I was thinking about this not as in articulate terms, but I was thinking, I've spent a whole 2 decades of my life thinking about the what and how, and now it's about the why. And it's because the why for the audience is just so much broader and less technical we've ever been. Danielle, ready? Should we go to Nadya and then round you out?
no, I'm going to build off of what we've said so far on the panel, which is just around partnerships and starting fast and getting in front of some of these initiatives. And the same way that an entrepreneur can get coaching from the C-suite around really tailoring the solution and providing value to the company, I think the entrepreneur comes to these organizations and provides, breath of fresh air around challenging and supporting how operations are done. So I would say partnerships and working with the startups, like don't be afraid to take those calculated risks.
Yeah, we're seeing that really firsthand as a lot of the manual processes that were about to get automated someday at some fiscal year and have been blown off for a while are now starting to really kind of manifest in that way. Nadya, round us out with your kind of key takeaway, and then I'll get us on to the next section.
All right, so I think I'll start with the challenge to embrace first, and then I'll go to the opportunity piece, which is, you've now heard me say it, in order for you to grow, you're going to have to understand the duties that are associated with intaking, handling, and processing data. So we've talked about data all day long. What we haven't talked about is the fact that it comes with duties, obligations, and responsibilities. And I would say it really actually can be pretty simple. It's like having a great relationship. If I have a personalized experience with a brand, here's what I want. I want to know why you're collecting my data, how you're going to use it, how long are you going to keep it, and where's it going? That's all I want. And you'd be surprised how many consumers, you are the consumer, by the way, you'd be surprised how many consumers will say, yeah, sure, that's okay. That's cool. I'm getting a good quid pro quo here. Don't treat it like cod liver oil, and be the owner of where your data is coming from, how it's going through your house. And then I would say the opportunity is with platforms and democratization and experts telling you how to measure what matters. Pick a technology that has to do, an innovative technology that may have to do with data, that is an innovation on what you're concerned about in terms of the growth you manage, right? Or the costs that you manage. All of us we're bonused on, if we're in a corporation, we're bonused on something. So pick that something and then just go do, on the side research and get comfortable with it. Because I think that what happens is, it's intimidating, so people shut down and then have private conversations with me back in my Experian days where it's, like they're confessing to marital woes or something. And that shouldn't be that way. It should be something joyful that we all talk about and we all innovate together.
Round of applause for our panel coming up here and hanging out. So I'll leave you with one final note here, which is to say that, we think an awful lot about how to help people that are incredibly analytical and data-driven, if not technical, think in terms of human connection and human authentic connection. I would just encourage everybody else, if you haven't already, to check out one last time that free and very free to use 1,000 hours of design thinking templates that have been specifically organized around helping data scientists and machine learning engineers and a variety of technically leaning folks start to express a sense of non-superficial empathy, right? Because that's really at the core of what's going to unlock data. So with that in mind, smarter and better minds will prevail. Sean, on to you.